Here's the Mindful Man. Hello, viewers. I'm just reading a few chapters from my book, which I've improved, called Dreamer. The chapters are very confusing. I'll just see if I can know where I'm going. They led him into the dark. He held whoever it was hand, not knowing the fate that awaited him. He was pushed into an old broken-down toilet, hardly used and almost forgotten. The light was broken, and only a thin strip of light shone under the door. Jack was 12. He was a solitary mummy's boy. His only friends were books and the television, but he preferred books. He was an easy target for bullies. Cobwebs were everywhere above and around him, and he didn't want to think about the spiders that lived there. He was terrified of spiders. The two boys laughed. "This is great fun," they said, and pushed Jack into the toilet seat. He was tired from all of the walking, and he was glad to sit down, however roughly. Jack was worried that they were going to hit him, and he had no way to defend himself. It was as if the inky darkness had entered his eyes and made them useless. He was afraid of the dark. This isn't good, he thought dejectedly. Before he could ask them what they wanted, they had locked the door behind him, and he was left alone with his thoughts. Things had been good a few years ago, but as he got older, he was finding himself to be more and more isolated and made fun of, and he didn't know why. It was just the way things were. His mum said it was because he was different, and she did her best to reassure him that things would get better. He knew they wouldn't. He sat down heavily on the toilet and began to cry. He knew that the front door was bolted shut and that there was little he could do to open it. Tears fell down his cheeks and onto the dusty, dirty floor. The ceiling was full of cobwebs, and he looked down at the dirty trench he was now standing in. There was no time to think. As a stray bullet whizzed past him and struck the soldier laying next to him, he fell down like a wet sack of potatoes. Jack was sure that he was still dreaming, but if he was, it was the most vivid dream he had ever experienced. He kicked a rat away as it ran over his boots, which were thick with mud. Jack picked up his rifle and felt its power in his hands. He peered through the sights, and he could only see the German. He was a young man just like him, and the last thing he wanted to do was to cut him down in his prime. Another bullet flew over his head and killed a sandbag, but Jack had no choice. He lifted up his rifle and looked through the sights with intensity. Mist and smoke swirled before his eyes, and he squinted the tears away. His finger pressed against the trigger as sweat poured off his brow and ran down his back like a river. Jack could see his enemy in the distance. He was young like him, with the same blue eyes and the same blonde hair blowing in the wind. Jack squeezed the trigger and the rifle jolted as the bullet flew across the muddy field and broken bodies which lay as dead and deserted as their hopes and dreams. Jack watched as the enemy fell, as if in slow motion. The bullet found its target and destroyed it. Guilt swept over Jack as he watched the boy die. He had become everything. Explosions rang in the distance. It was like living in hell, Jack thought, as more bullets took the men away from him. A young fellow tapped him on the shoulder. "Fancy a smoke," he said with a grin. He passed Jack a cigarette which was hanging from his filthy fingers. "Thanks," said Jack as his companion lit it with shaking hands. His name was Robbie. He was Scottish. It was difficult to know what he was saying, but Jack tried. He hated the smell of smoke, but he wasn't going to rock the boat, considering the predicament they were both in. He breathed in the smoke, and he felt it curl round his lungs and then come out of his mouth like a dragon. Jack began coughing. "Keep it down," said Robbie, who was now himself covered in a cloud of smoke. It was almost comical. Bombs exploded in the distance like fireworks, and then a tank came rolling over the thick mud and crushing bodies beneath its gigantic, heavy tracks. Hope you enjoyed that first chapter.